Caleb Walker returns to Clearwater Springs only to find a tall fence barricading his beloved ranch. The truck tires crunch to a halt on the dusty road, golden leaves swirling up around the fenders as Caleb killed the engine. He stared ahead, disbelief settling heavy in his chest. There, stretching from one end of the property to the other, stood a gleaming steel fence, taller than a man on horseback, crowned with spiked tips that gleamed cruelly under the late October sun. Caleb climbed out, boots thudding onto the gravel. A crisp autumn breeze stirred his jacket as he crossed the short distance to the locked gate. Thick metal chains wrapped around the bars, holding a fresh industrial padlock at the center. Hung neatly on the fence was a polished sign that read, "Private Property, Pinewood Meadows, HOA" in bold letters. Caleb reached out and gripped the cold iron, rattling it once. It barely shivered. Behind the fence, the familiar pastures of his ranch rolled into the distance unchanged, and yet somehow farther away, like a memory slipping out of reach. A muscle in Caleb's jaw twitched. Sheriff Buck once joked, "City folks are tricky with paper, not with fences," and now the words came back to him sharp as a thorn. Movement caught his eye beyond the far end of the fence. A figure in a bright red jacket pointed and gestured at two construction workers stacking leftover materials onto a truck bed. Even at this distance, Caleb recognized the sharp bob of Patricia Smythe's hair, the ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm. She stood like a general surveying a conquered field. Caleb forced himself to breathe slow. No good would come from hollering across a field of metal and dried-up goodwill. Instead, he turned and traced the perimeter of the fence with his eyes, toward the side road that ran adjacent to the new housing development. He spotted something odd. Small, neon orange survey flags stabbed into the earth, fluttering weakly in the breeze. His hands slid into the pockets of his jeans as he walked back to the truck, boots stirring up the scent of dry earth and crushed leaves. He cast one long glance over the scene before climbing in. The engine roared reluctantly to life. Caleb pointed the nose of the truck toward Town the Diner and hopefully a cup of coffee strong enough to chase away the growing fury bubbling in his chest. Betty's Diner sat nestled between the old feed store and the hardware shop, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the gathering dusk. Caleb pushed through the glass door, the familiar scent of frying bacon and fresh-baked pie washing over him. Inside the usual crowd was gathered old-timers in plaid shirts and scuffed boots, trading stories about the upcoming deer season and who had the best homemade apple pie. Betty herself, all silver hair and knowing smiles, slid a chipped ceramic mug across the counter before Caleb even said a word. "Welcome back, Caleb," she said, topping off his coffee without asking. "Missed the pie contest last weekend. Shame, too. Earl's boy took first place with a buttermilk pumpkin special." Caleb managed a thin smile, wrapping both hands around the warm mug. The simple chatter of the diner buzzed around him. Talk of hunting licenses. The first hints of winter. The best place to get new tires before the frost set in. It was the heartbeat of Clearwater Springs, steady and familiar. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window where the golden leaves drifted in slow, lazy spirals to the cracked sidewalk. The ranch sat just beyond that horizon, caged like an animal in a zoo, fenced off from the town it had once been part of. A heavy thunk beside him snapped Caleb back to the present. Old Man Jenkins hunched and weathered like an old oak tree, settled onto the stool next to him, plopping a crumpled Stetson onto the counter. Jenkins didn't look at Caleb right away. Instead, he accepted a cup of coffee from Betty with a grateful grunt, warming his gnarled hands around it. Finally, after a moment of quiet, he leaned closer, voice so low it barely stirred the air between them. "There's a way around that fence, son." Over a second coffee refill, Mr. Grady leaned in close and said, "They forgot a little sliver of land, didn't read the fine print." Caleb Walker listened, elbows resting on the weathered oak table of Grady's porch. The swing creaked slowly behind them, rocked by a lazy autumn breeze that smelled of dry hay and distant wood smoke. A pitcher of iced, sweet tea sweated on the table, two glasses sitting half full between them. Somewhere across the yard ranch, dogs barked and chased each other in the dirt, kicking up little clouds that glowed golden in the afternoon light. Grady's face crinkled into a knowing grin. City lawyers think they know everything, but land out here's got memory, boy. It remembers deals made long before their fancy clipboards. Caleb chuckled low under his breath. The tension of the last 24 hours easing slightly, he thought back to the storm last year, when Grady's old barn had collapsed under high winds. Caleb had spent 2 long weekends helping him rebuild it, hammering beams and resetting posts without expecting a thing in return. He hadn't done it for favors. It was just the right thing to do. Now maybe the right thing was coming back around. Grady reached into the folder at his side, pulling out a map yellowed by time, its edges curling like the bark of a river birch. With a stubby finger, he pointed to a thin, almost invisible strip of land cutting across the front boundary where the HOA's new gate now stood, 5 feet wide, runs clean across. Never sold it off when the rest went to the developers, pure oversight on their part. Caleb leaned in his heart, thrumming a steady, deliberate beat, and it's still yours. For now. Grady sipped his tea, the ice cubes clinking softly. But an old fella like me don't have much use for a strip of dust and mesquite, especially when I know someone who might need it more. The transaction didn't take long. Grady, ever the man of his word, had the paperwork drawn up by a local title agent he trusted. Caleb signed with a steady hand, tucking the fresh deed into the inside pocket of his denim jacket with the kind of reverence other men might reserve for a newborn baby. The swing behind them groaned again as Grady stood up, brushing crumbs of cornbread off his jeans. Back when I was a surveyor, saw all kinds of city folks try to wrangle land they didn't own. Fancy maps, high talk, never bothered to walk the dirt themselves. He spat off the porch into the dusty yard. You walk the land, Caleb. You know its shape, its breadth. That's worth more than all their papers. Caleb thanked him with a firm handshake, the kind that said everything words could not. Grady's grip was still strong, belying his years. By the time Caleb's truck rumbled back onto the main road, the sun was dipping low, painting the world in long shadows and deep bronze. He drove slow windows down the crisp air, whipping through the cab. His mind worked steadily, quietly piecing together the next steps like setting fence posts straight and true. He wouldn't fight them in the open, wouldn't shout, wouldn't beg. Caleb would win the same way the land had survived 100 years of storms and fools, by being patient, by standing still when others lost their footing. The streets of Clearwater Springs grew busier as he neared the center of town. Folks were out decorating storefronts for the coming harvest fair. Pumpkins, bundles of corn stalks, hay bales stacked into cheerful displays. Children chased each other with paper leaf garlands while parents swapped stories over cider cups. Life as always carried on. Caleb slowed as he approached the stretch of low brick buildings that made up the town's modest civic block. Among them stood the Pinewood Meadows HOA office, glassy and polished out of place among the weathered wood and hand-painted signs of the older businesses. As he idled at the corner waiting for a pair of teenagers to cross the street with caramel apples in hand, his gaze shifted instinctively to the HOA building. There, framed in the wide front window, stood Patricia Smythe, her posture rigid, her mouth moving in sharp, clipped motions. Opposite her, a young woman, early 20s, Caleb guessed, stood with arms crossed, body language stiff and defensive. Her hair was a shade darker than Patricia's, her face striking in a softer, more thoughtful way. Patricia jabbed a finger toward the woman's chest. The young woman flinched, but didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned forward, responding in a tone that seemed low but firm, the kind of voice born from a long line of suppressed arguments finally bubbling up. Caleb didn't catch the words through the glass, but he didn't have to. The tension between them was thick enough to choke on. He recognized something else, too, the familiar look of someone caught between duty and conscience. As Caleb eased the truck forward, the younger woman's eyes lifted almost by instinct, catching his for a brief heartbeat through the windshield. She looked away just as quickly, but not before Caleb saw the flicker there. Guilt, maybe, or regret. He turned the corner, the engine humming steady, the signed deed a warm weight against his side. As Caleb passed the HOA office, he noticed Patricia Smythe and a younger woman arguing near the window. Caleb pulled up to the festival grounds with a private property sign and a key that could break a kingdom. The truck rumbled low as he guided it across the gravel shoulder, parking near the side entrance of Clearwater Springs Community Field. Morning mist still clung stubbornly to the hay bales stacked high for the fall festival. The scent of roasting corn and fresh apple cider floated through the cool air, mingling with bursts of laughter as volunteers scurried about setting up booths. Bright orange pumpkins lined the walkways, and banners in shades of russet and gold fluttered from the lampposts. Caleb stepped out of his truck slowly, his boots crunching against loose gravel. In one hand he carried a sturdy wooden stake with a painted sign nailed to it. Private property. No trespassing without owner consent. In the other, he dangled the small brass key that now represented everything they had tried to lock away. He made no grand show of it, just a man on his land doing what needed doing. Travis Walker, his cousin, waited by the pickup's tailgate, grinning wide beneath his faded ball cap. The trick ain't fighting loud. Caleb had once told Travis, it's fighting smart. And smart meant timing. Today, with the whole town already gathering for the festivities, there would be no quiet way for the HOA to sweep this under the rug. Caleb walked up the short gravel path leading to the locked gate. Eyes turned. Conversations paused. By the time he reached the fence, half a dozen folks had already noticed whispering among themselves. Without a word, Caleb planted the sign firmly into the soft earth just to the right of the gate post. The hammer he carried thudded twice, sharp and clean. Then slowly and deliberately he slid the brass key into the heavy padlock. The mechanism clicked open with a satisfying snap. Caleb swung the gate wide with a rusty groan, stepping back and letting it stand yawning open like a silent invitation. The reaction came almost instantly. From the far end of the grounds, Patricia Smythe stormed across the lawn. Her heels stabbing into the soft ground, her crisp white blouse already showing dark patches of sweat. Behind her trailed two other board members, faces tight with panic. "What do you think you're doing?" Patricia's voice cut through the chatter like a whip crack. Drawing even more heads their way, Caleb didn't flinch. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers, handing them calmly to Sheriff Buck Daniels, who had appeared from the cider booth with a steaming mug in hand. Buck took his time unfolding the documents, scanning them with practiced eyes. He scratched his jaw, grunted once, and turned back toward the gathering crowd. "Deed's clean," he announced, voice carrying across the festival grounds. "Property line runs right under that gate. Caleb owns it." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Some folks nodded slowly. Others simply stared at Patricia, waiting to see what she would do. Patricia's face twisted into something sour enough to curdle milk. This is outrageous. This disrupts the unity of Pinewood Meadows." Caleb met her gaze with the steady patience of a stone. "Ain't disrupting anything, ma'am. Just taking care of what's mine." The standoff stretched thin in the cool air every second. Dragging heavier, Patricia's hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. The clipboard she carried trembling slightly. For a moment, it looked like she might say something more, might launch into another tirade about aesthetics or community standards, but Buck's solid presence beside Caleb seemed to weigh her down. She swallowed hard, turned on her heel and stalked off toward the makeshift main tent where the HOA volunteers were trying and failing to pretend nothing was happening. Caleb didn't smile. He didn't need to. Around him, small signs of shifting winds were already taking shape. An elderly couple near the hayride booth tipped their heads respectfully as he passed Betty from the diner, waved from her pie contest table, flour dusting her apron. Even some of the newer families, the ones who had hesitated before, now looked at him with something closer to trust than suspicion. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long orange shadows across the grounds. Bonfires at the far edge of the field began to crackle to life, their smoke curling into the deepening sky. The smell of roasting corn and maple syrup thickened, wrapping the festival in a haze of warmth and memory. Caleb paused by his truck, scanning the festival one last time. The tension was still there. coiled tight in some places, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like the noose around his neck. It felt like a rope he could hold on to. Movement by the HOA booth caught his attention. Emma Smythe stood slightly apart from the others, arms crossed loosely over her chest. Unlike her mother, she wasn't barking orders or clutching at clipboards. Instead, she watched Caleb with a look that didn't fit the scorn written across the rest of the board's faces. It was something else entirely, something quieter. As Caleb turned to load his toolbox into the bed of the truck, he caught her glance once more just briefly. She dropped her eyes quickly, but not before the hesitation flickered across her face, plain as day. Emma stood back silently, glancing nervously toward Caleb, a decision brewing inside her. Just as the Fall Festival parade began, the fire marshal was called, but it wasn't about a fire. The morning had broken bright and crisp, a thin mist lifting off the fields as townsfolk bustled around Main Street. Booths, draped in orange and burgundy cloth, lined the sidewalks, tables heavy with pumpkin pies, apple preserves, knitted scarves, and wood-carved ornaments. Children clutched paper crowns made of yellow leaves, their laughter mixing with the clip-clop of the parade's first ponies trotting proudly past the cafe. Caleb Walker manned a modest booth near the pie contest table, where he sold hand-carved horseshoes stamped with the Freedom Arena logo. Beside him, Travis poked good-natured fun at passing friends, while Betty offered slices of pie, free for old-timers but double for HOA members, which earned her more than a few chuckles. The smell of roasting corn and cinnamon drifted thick in the air, blending with the sweet crackle of bonfires just beginning to kindle at either end of the street. Caleb leaned against the corner of his booth, arms crossed, soaking in the slow rhythm of the festival. It felt almost normal, almost like Clearwater Springs hadn't spent the last year under a growing invisible weight. But good moments around these parts had a way of being tested. A sudden hush swept up the street. Folks turned as a crisp navy uniform and a bright yellow helmet pushed through the crowd. It was Deputy Fire Marshal Higgins, clipboard in hand, expression tight. He walked straight toward Caleb's booth. Behind him, Patricia Smythe hovered like a crow, flanked by two other HOA board members. Their smiles were brittle as dried leaves. Higgins cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, we've received a report. Your booth violates Safety Code 14B, obstructing egress for emergency vehicles." Caleb caught sight of Travis's eyebrows shooting up in disbelief. Sheriff Buck's old warning echoed in Caleb's memory, steady and sure. "When they can't win clean, they'll try dirty." Caleb reached calmly into the satchel beneath his table and pulled out a laminated paper. He unfolded it without hurry, holding it out for the deputy marshal to read. "County Safety Certificate." Caleb said simply, "Pre-approved." Last Thursday, Inspector Sanchez signed it himself. Higgins adjusted his glasses, scanning the paper, his forehead creased, then smoothed. He nodded once, sharp and certain. "No violations here," he said loudly enough for nearby booths to hear. "Booths compliant." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a trout on a riverbank. One of her companions leaned in and whispered furiously, but there was no unsaying it now. Sheriff Buck, having drifted over with a cider cup in one hand, chuckled under his breath and clapped Caleb lightly on the shoulder. "All good here," Buck said. His voice was mild, but his eyes held a glint of steel. "Y'all enjoy the parade now." Caleb tipped his hat politely, feeling dozens of eyes swing from him back to Patricia. Some faces wore curiosity, others suspicion. A few showed the first sparks of anger. At the pie booth, Betty pretended to adjust a tray of baked goods, while very obviously grinning to herself. Across the way, Old Man Jenkins nudged his wife and whispered something that made her laugh aloud. The festival carried on, but a current had shifted. It was subtle like the first ripple before a flood, but it was there. Folks remembered what fairness looked like and what bullying smelled like, even when wrapped in official badges and crisp fall sweaters. Caleb returned to his booth nodding to familiar faces who offered small smiles of support. He spotted Emma Smythe standing by the cider stand, arms folded tight across her chest. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't defending her mother either. Instead, she stared at Patricia with an expression that wasn't anger, but wasn't loyalty either. Something harder to name. Emma's hands tightened around the paper cup she held, knuckles whitening before she turned away and disappeared into the crowd. The day wore into evening. Dusk slid its long fingers over Clearwater Springs, painting the hay bales and scarecrows in deep gold and burnished orange. Children skipped past carrying candles in mason jars, giggling under strings of fairy lights draped between lampposts. Music floated up from the main square where a fiddler warmed up on a low stage, tuning his strings to match the heartbeat of the town. The bonfires cracked louder now, snapping like old friends swapping stories across the chill. By the time Caleb packed up his booth and loaded the leftover horseshoes into the back of his truck, stars had begun to scatter like spilled salt across the deepening sky. The festival had survived, but tonight Caleb knew wouldn't end quietly. The drive home was peaceful enough, the roads dark except for the occasional jack-o'-lantern grinning from a porch. He parked by the house and checked Ranger's food and water bowls before stepping inside to grab a coffee. He was halfway through stirring sugar into his cup when the motion sensor alarm blipped once. Then again, Caleb set the mug down carefully and moved to the window, slipping the edge of the curtain back with 2 fingers. The security camera monitor blinked into life on the wall. There they were. 2 figures masked, crouching low near the eastern fence line. One held a flashlight. The other something metallic that caught the moonlight, maybe wire cutters, maybe worse. They moved fast, slipping from post to post, clearly thinking themselves unseen. Caleb stayed perfectly still, jaw tight, heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. Late at night, Caleb's security cameras capture masked figures lurking along his fence line under the silver light of the half-moon. Someone slipped past the fence, but Caleb was ready. He sat in the darkened living room, boots planted firm on the worn wooden floor, a thermos of coffee cooling beside him. Ranger, his old cattle dog, lay alert at his feet, ears flicking toward the faintest sound outside. The only light came from the flickering feed on the small monitor tucked into the corner of the room, showing grainy black and white footage from the new cameras he'd wired along the property line. Out beyond the fence, the prairie grass whispered with the touch of an unseen hand. An owl hooted once, a lonely call floating across the hills. The security alarm had triggered low and silent just minutes earlier. Caleb hadn't rushed. He hadn't grabbed a shotgun or flicked on a spotlight. He waited. Watched. On the screen, 2 figures crept through the shadows, their forms barely darker than the night around them. Both wore black hooded sweatshirts, gloves, heavy boots. They moved fast like men with a job to do, and not much time to do it. Caleb adjusted the tiny joystick on the console beside him, high above the barn. A small drone shifted silently in the breeze, its night vision camera panning to follow the intruders. The men made straight for the hay storage by the southern fence line where, tucked behind bales of dry feed, Caleb kept a pair of old empty fuel tanks. Empty now, but a careless spark near dry hay could still cause a world of trouble. Through the infrared lens, Caleb caught the glint of metal in one man's hand. A siphon pump, maybe, or something worse. The other man held a small black canister, fumbling with it in the dim light. Caleb's fingers moved fast. With a few quick taps, he transferred the live feed to Sheriff Buck Daniels' direct line. No sirens, no shouting. Just a simple message. 2 men, south fence. Hay barn. Attempted sabotage. He leaned back, letting the night unfold. Minutes later, headlights flared at the far edge of the property. 2 sheriff's cruisers nosed onto the dirt track. Lights off, engines low and purring like mountain lions stalking prey. Deputies moved quick and silent, boots pounding soft against the dry ground. The saboteurs barely had time to react. One dropped his gear and bolted for the tree line. The other stumbled, tangled in a coil of loose fencing wire Caleb had stacked days before, and went down hard. Ranger let out a low, pleased growl as Caleb watched the screen. Sheriff Buck himself climbed out of the lead car, barked orders, and cuffed the man who hadn't gotten away. From the camera's angle, Caleb caught a glimpse of the suspect's face, pale. Sweating, maybe no older than 30, he didn't recognize him, but the expensive boots and shiny watch peeking from under the sweatshirt told a story all their own. City folks later, while deputies swept the area, Buck called Caleb directly. "Got one in custody," the sheriff said. "Other one vanished into the woods, but we'll get a scent trail by morning. From what we can tell, they plan to rig something to the hay bales. Probably an accelerant." Caleb listened without interrupting, letting the words settle into the quiet space between heartbeats. "Attempted arson, Caleb. That's a felony," Buck added grimly, and judging by who's stirring the pot lately, he didn't need to finish. The line between suspicion and certainty was starting to blur fast. "Footage is yours." Caleb said simply, "I'm keeping my copy, too. Good man." They hung up. Caleb leaned back in his chair, letting the tension bleed out of his shoulders. Ranger bumped his nose against Caleb's boot tail, thumping once against the floorboards. "Still got work to do, boy," Caleb murmured, ruffling the dog's ears. The footage was good, crisp enough to see faces even behind masks once the video enhancement was done, clear enough to show the canisters marked flammable, the tampering near the fuel tanks. The illegal entry across the fence line Caleb now legally owned. Evidence. Real evidence. The kind no HOA lawyer or city council sweet-talker could explain away. He backed up the files onto 2 separate hard drives, locking one in a small safe beneath the kitchen floorboards. Insurance, he thought, against storms, whether they came with thunder or with subpoenas. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the dry grass like distant applause. Somewhere beyond the hills, the first pale fingers of dawn stretched into the night, brushing the horizon with the faintest promise of light. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit and exhaustion settle deeper in his bones. But he wasn't done yet. By the time the sun slid free of the hills, Caleb had cleaned up the drone, rechecked the security feeds, and double-bolted the barn. When he finally climbed into his truck to head into town for a badly needed breakfast, he felt the heavy ache of a night spent not fighting, but surviving and winning quietly. The streets of Clearwater Springs were just beginning to stir storefronts, opening, the scent of strong coffee and frying bacon spilling out onto the sidewalks. As Caleb rolled slowly past the diner, he spotted a figure tucked into the shadowed doorway. Emma Smythe. She stood stiffly. Jacket pulled tight against the morning chill, a manila envelope clutched tight in both hands. Her eyes darted up at Caleb's passing truck, wide and uncertain, like someone poised at the edge of a decision she could no longer avoid. Caleb eased off the gas heart, ticking once in warning, as the world narrowed down to that envelope. And the silent, desperate look on Emma's face, Caleb spots Emma, waiting nervously by the town diner early next morning, a manila envelope clutched in her hand. "They fenced you out, Caleb. Now it's time to fence them in," Travis said, sliding a dusty land deed across the diner table. The early morning sun filtered through the smudged windows of Betty's diner, casting long beams of golden light across the worn linoleum floors. The smell of frying bacon and maple syrup filled the air, mixing with the faint sharpness of fresh coffee, brewing behind the counter. Caleb picked up the brittle piece of parchment, his fingers tracing the faded ink. The land deed looked fragile, like it might crumble if breathed on wrong, but its meaning hit harder than any hammer he'd ever swung. Grady's old warning echoed in Caleb's memory. Forgotten strips of land overlooked by fancy developers too proud to walk the dirt themselves. Travis leaned back in the booth, grinning wide under the brim of his hat. Turns out, when old man Grady sold off the main parcels, he kept a few stitches of fabric right through the heart of the quilt. And that fancy HOA headquarters. He tapped the table with one calloused finger. Built square on a 6-foot-wide strip Grady never signed over, which means... Caleb smiled slow and sure, the weight of months finally beginning to shift off his shoulders. "Means they're squatting on my land now." Across the diner, Sheriff Buck nursed a mug of coffee. Pretending not to listen, and failing miserably, Caleb folded the deed carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Time to make things official. The courthouse smelled the way old courthouses always did. Dust, old parchment cracked leather bindings. The records room sat in the basement where fluorescent lights flickered and a single desk fan pushed stale air in tired circles. The county clerk, a wiry man named Ed Collins who had been around long enough to remember when the diner had nickel pie specials, peered at the documents Caleb handed him. "You're telling me," Ed started adjusting his glasses, "that this strip right here, right under Pinewood Meadows' shiny headquarters, still belongs to the original deed holder." Caleb finished, "Now deeded legally to me." Ed gave a low whistle. "Lord Almighty! Somebody at their office is going to have a heart attack when they hear this." The stamp thudded down on the papers with a satisfying clunk. It was official. As they left the courthouse, Emma Smythe appeared from around the corner, bundled in a gray sweater, eyes darting nervously down the street before she approached. Without a word, she pressed a slim manila envelope into Caleb's hand and then vanished back the way she'd come, melting into the Saturday morning bustle. Caleb didn't open it until they reached Travis's truck. Inside were printed emails, internal HOA communications complete with letterheads and timestamps. He skimmed through them quickly, his stomach tightening with each line. The HOA board had known about the land defect before construction began, had voted to proceed at risk, betting no one would notice, had even drafted contingency plans in case the ownership issue ever came to light, plans that involved smear campaigns, pressure tactics, and the quiet purchase of silence. "Smoking gun," Travis muttered, eyes wide. "Hand delivered." Caleb tucked the envelope into the same jacket pocket as the deed. His mind ticked forward, already mapping the next move. It would be tempting to go straight to the papers, to the sheriff, to the town council. But a public wound needed a public treatment. Clearwater Springs had been dragged step by painful step into Pinewood Meadows' orbit. Now they needed to see the whole thing torn apart by the roots. Sheriff Buck agreed. They met that afternoon at the station where Buck carefully drafted an official notice of eviction for unauthorized occupation of private property. "You want me to hand deliver it?" Buck asked, a glint in his eye. Caleb smiled, slow and sure. "Better you than me. I might grin too wide." The timing had to be perfect. Saturday evening, the fall festival was still in full swing. Townsfolk crowded the square, sipping cider, picking through tables of handmade quilts and preserves, swapping old hunting stories and gossip. Caleb leaned against the tailgate of his truck, arms folded, watching as Sheriff Buck marched straight up the steps of the Pinewood Meadows HOA office. The building loomed all shiny windows and over-polished floors completely out of place against the rustic charm of the town. Buck pulled a single sheet of paper from a thick folder. With calm precision, he nailed it to the glass door with 3 hard, echoing taps of a hammer. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The sound rang out over the square like a church bell calling sinners home. Curious faces turned toward the commotion. Old Man Jenkins muttered something to his wife, who covered her mouth in a gasp. Betty poked her head out of the pie tent, wiping her hands on her apron. The notice was plain and bold. Eviction, unauthorized occupation. Immediate cessation of operations, owner. Caleb Walker. Patricia Smythe pushed her way through the gathering crowd, her face pale and thunderous. She reached the steps, staring up at the paper lips moving without sound. Caleb caught her eye across the square. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply stood there, quiet and unmovable, as the realization slammed into her full force. This wasn't a skirmish anymore. This was the beginning of the end. Patricia watched livid, realizing too late that the town was already siding with Caleb. The courthouse steps gleamed under the Texas sun, and Patricia Smythe was about to lose it all. The midday heat clung heavy to the square, rippling off the pavement in lazy waves. Overhead, the bright blue sky stretched wide and cloudless, as if the heavens themselves had cleared a front-row seat for the show about to unfold. Caleb Walker stood near the base of the old limestone courthouse, his hands tucked loose into the pockets of his jeans. Next to him, Travis adjusted the collar of his Sunday shirt and grinned like a boy fixing to watch fireworks. Townsfolk gathered in clusters around the courthouse lawn, some clutching lemonade cups, others shading their eyes with calloused hands. A few wore Freedom Arena ball caps, fresh off the printing press, a quiet symbol of where their loyalties now lay. 2 local news vans, idled by the curb logos, splashed across the doors. Allison Price Clearwater's most dogged reporter adjusted her microphone and whispered cues to the cameraman. Beneath the shade of the courthouse oak, Emma Smythe lingered, arms folded tight, her face pale but set. She didn't move toward Caleb, didn't need to. The small, almost imperceptible nod she gave him across the distance said everything. Sheriff Buck Daniels cleared his throat and stepped forward to the makeshift podium. A few flashes popped from camera bulbs as he laid out the morning's business in plain measured words. Illegal occupation of private land, fraudulent filings with the county clerk's office, conspiracy to misappropriate community resources. The charges stacked up neatly like cordwood, ready for the fire. Buck spoke slow, each word heavier than the last, giving the gathered crowd and the watching cameras no excuse to misunderstand. Caleb stood back silent, steady as an old oak. No smirks, no gloating, he let the truth hang there, patient as gravity. Then, like a dry branch snapping under too much weight, Patricia Smythe exploded onto the scene. She barreled up the courthouse steps. Hair flying lipstick smudged her crisp blazer askew. In one hand she clutched a thick sheaf of papers, waving them wildly above her head like a battle flag. "This is a setup," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the warm afternoon like a knife. "A conspiracy. Caleb Walker has deceived you all." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back instinctively. Others leaned forward hungry for the kind of spectacle they usually only got on late-night television. Patricia spun, pointing a trembling finger first at Caleb, then at Sheriff Buck, then wildly toward the news crews. "He bought off the sheriff, bought off the judge, my own daughter." She caught sight of Emma, standing still beneath the oak tree. Something broke in Patricia's face, something raw and ugly. "You!" she screeched, jabbing a finger toward Emma. "You ungrateful little traitor. After everything I built, after everything I gave you." Emma didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. She just stared back, her silence louder than any accusation Patricia could spit. The cameras whirred, the crowd stood frozen, even the hot wind seemed to hold its breath. Sheriff Buck stepped forward again, badge glinting in the sun. His voice was low, final. "Patricia Ann Smythe, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful occupation of private property. You have the right to remain silent." Patricia shrieked and lunged for the nearest microphone, grabbing it with both hands. "This isn't justice. This is a coup. I made this town better. I made it beautiful. You'll regret this. Every one of you." Deputies moved in firm, but not rough, pulling her arms gently behind her back. The click of handcuffs sounded loud in the summer air. Patricia fought them, her body-twisting voice rising into a desperate, ragged wail that echoed off the courthouse walls. "This isn't over," she screamed, struggling against the hands that guided her down the steps toward the waiting cruiser. Caleb didn't speak, didn't lift a hand. He simply stood there, steady and unmoving, and as Patricia was hustled past him, he tipped his hat slightly in a slow, deliberate motion. A silent farewell to all the noise and poison she had tried to spread. And for the first time in a long, bitter year, Clearwater Springs stood still and watched a false queen fall. A month later, the sun set gently over Freedom Arena, laughter and music filling the crisp autumn air. Golden light spilled over the wide-open fields, catching on the flutter of American flags posted along the arena fence. Smoke from hickory fires curled lazily into the sky, carrying the sweet smell of slow-cooked brisket and spiced apple cider. The Texas horizon stretched wide and forgiving as if the land itself exhaled a long-held breath. The grand opening of Freedom Arena had drawn everyone from Clearwater Springs and even a few folks from neighboring counties. Families perched on bleachers fashioned from old barnwood kids, ran wild through hay bale mazes, and clusters of veterans swapped stories by the flagpole while sipping sweet tea from mason jars. Caleb Walker stood near the main gate boots, dusted from the day's preparations, his hands resting easy on his belt buckle. He wore no badge, no official title, but the weight of what he'd built, what they had reclaimed together, settled around his shoulders like a second skin. Nearby, Emma Smythe helped Betty slice pies at the contest table, laughing softly as a group of children begged for extra samples. The shadows under Emma's eyes had faded. She moved easier now, lighter, as if the invisible chains that once tied her to another life had finally snapped free. Sheriff Buck Daniels wandered over, handing Caleb a brown envelope with a grin tugging at his weathered face. "Official business," Buck said, voice low. Inside was a plaque, simple, heavy engraved in solid brass. It read, "Protector of Clearwater Springs." Caleb thumbed the edge of it, feeling the deep grooves of the letters. He didn't say much, just nodded once. A slow dip of his head that said everything words couldn't. Buck chuckled and pulled something else from behind his back, a large, old-fashioned iron key mounted on a block of polished oak. "Made it myself," Buck said. "Figure it belongs to the real gatekeeper of freedom around here." Caleb ran his fingers over the rough iron, the kind of craftsmanship no machine could replicate. His throat tightened unexpectedly, but he swallowed it down, accepting the gift with quiet reverence. The rodeo exhibitions kicked up dust as kids tried their hand at roping hay bales dressed like steer. Somewhere a fiddler struck up a fast tune, and couples took to the packed dirt dance floor laid out under strings of glowing bulbs. Boots tapped, skirts twirled, laughter rolled across the arena like a warm tide. Travis whooped as he lost a pie-eating contest to a 10-year-old girl, crumbs dusting his shirt. Betty crowned the girl with a wreath of plastic autumn leaves, her cheeks rosy with pride. Across the way, Old Man Jenkins hoisted a cider mug in Caleb's direction, his eyes twinkling. A silent toast from one stubborn old soul to another. Caleb stood back from it all, letting the scene fill him. Children's laughter echoed off the open sky. A fiddler's melody floated on the cooling breeze, and the smell of barbecue clung sweet and rich to the crisp air. Grady's words floated back to him. Then, warm and true, "The land remembers who treats it kindly." And here it was, remembering, rewarding healing. The old HOA was gone now, legally dissolved after the storm of lawsuits and resignations. In its place stood a simple volunteer-run civic association, small enough to be neighborly, strong enough to keep Clearwater Springs the way it was meant to be, free, messy, and real. No gates, no false kings, just folks shoulder to shoulder building something they all owned together. As the last rays of sun melted into the western hills, Caleb walked the perimeter of the arena. He paused by a fence post near the entrance, the same one he'd leaned against a lifetime ago when the first signs of trouble brewed. He rested a boot against the bottom rail and looked out over the gathering. The little kids swinging sticks like lariats, the old-timers nursing mugs of cider, the couples spinning under the porch lights, the quiet pride in the air, so thick it seemed stitched into every breath. Caleb tipped his hat low against the rising evening breeze. No grand speeches, no big gestures, just a man, his land, and a future earned the hard way. The fiddles sang sweeter as night crept in, stars beginning to prick through the deepening velvet of the sky. Smoke curled upward from the last of the barbecue pits, and somewhere across the arena, a boy let out a joyful holler as he lassoed a hay bale. Clean, Caleb smiled slow and easy, the kind of smile that came from the marrow of a man who knew he had stood his ground and won something bigger than pride, freedom unfenced, stronger than before. And as the music rolled over the hills, Caleb stayed where he was, boots planted, hat tipped low. The land and the people breathing in rhythm around him stitched together again by laughter, by home, and by the simple stubborn promise that no fence would ever cage them again. As the last notes of the fiddle faded into the autumn sky, Clearwater Springs stood stronger, stitched together by laughter, trust, and the memory of a long, hard fight. Freedom had been reclaimed not with shouting, but with steady hands, clear hearts, and a belief that right still matters. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble under their own weight. Maybe it's never too late to lean over a fence, share a story, and remember that true strength is found in standing together unwalled and unafraid.